All right, so we're the keeners who are here a little bit early. There's a few other folks who I think are going to be drifting in, but the overall topic that we're this got prompted by Marie Birede talking about AI and solving some of the issues around unmanagement. But we decided to have a bigger conversation around AI and democracy and unmanagement and kind of collective intelligence and all of these different pieces. Maybe we can just rehash a tiny bit of what we were just talking about, which I think was really interesting. So you were just talking a little bit about both how do these tools get tuned for things like GPT and about why that's important. So maybe I'll toss things back over to you to.
Oh, I always bring up the idea, it's a central something I've come across in some philosophy traditions or, mystic traditions, the idea of whether you're trying to get the answers or getting to better questions. Um, and when we're in a society that's often reductive in the thinking, the tendency can be to try to get to good or people. There's a demand for people having, they want life to be simple. So to have nice, clear answers to things rather than uh, the process of asking better questions and seeing that there's multiple ways of seeing things. And there can be some paradox and there can be, getting comfortable with like um, the unknowability of certain things. So it would be amazing to do a fine tuning process. And we don't know enough about how these models were fine tuned, where whatever, a large amount of us were participating in fine tuning the model, where the point is to us to be training up our ability to ask good questions, and we're training it up to help us ask good questions and get to that juicy stuff. And I think that would be a fascinating process.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I mean, I think one of the things that always strikes me, and I mean, when we get to that sort of collective intelligence democracy side of things, that strikes me that LLMs are really good at mashing up disparate and discrete bodies of knowledge or perspectives on things. They're not necessarily good at generating, mind-blowingly innovative things out of it, but they're good at mashing them up and
Mm.
mixing that with that piece of being able to find, when you mash these bits of knowledge together, or these different approaches, what are the interesting questions? What are the different things which you can then toss back to humanity and ideally, um, you know, get some interesting responses coming back that can be deep and rich and nuanced and contradictory and varying degrees of sensible, but to kind of inform how that decision moves, that discussion moves forward. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm interested in, if there's one of the things that we'll see Marie will probably talk more about in it, but that was talking about, like, really looking at how to engage in civic discourse in a way that is so much richer than the sort of polling data approach that is typically taken right now. And the ways that these tools can facilitate that. And I know Saeed and I have also been talking a little bit about that, of what does it mean to tease out from people greater engagement in the deeper issues in civic discourse that are underlying the decisions that have to get made.
Ah. Yeah, that brings up one of the strengths I found about AI is the ability, as it moves towards being having more search engine capabilities, but where I remember 20 years ago or 30 years ago, I was having all these ideas on kind of like what I was calling live insta polling, where you can have a group of people, everybody's got a device, and we're able to like sort of be on a liquid kind of level, seeing what people think of things, even as we talk about it and people's opinions change. Or well, then based on that, what do you now think about this? And that we can have this ongoing feedback from the group about perspectives. But I can talk about that to the AI and be like, who's working on stuff like this? And then it'll come back with all these results from different fields that are using different words to describe that. If I Google like live insta polling, who knows what I'll find, right? But I'll only find people using that specific terminology. While one of the major language models will be much more flexible and bring back, oh, well, there's this group at MIT doing this thing I would never know you would call something like that. But I'm like, oh yeah, that is what I'm talking about. But they're using the network graph theory
Right.
language to describe it.
Yeah.
Um, I hadn't occurred to me you would use those words to talk about a process like that. And then poof, it starts giving me a list of these websites and organizations and like laboratories around the world that are doing like, oh, that's all related to what I was curious about. And almost none of them are using the words that I was using. Um, and that is one of the real strengths of these models, is to cross sort of the linguistic divides between people who are sharing interests without realizing it. Yeah.
It's like a rebuilding of the Tower of Babel in some ways, of having it so that all of those different, different siloed areas of related discourse that are unaware of each other can
Exactly. Yeah.
barriers. Two things that come to mind with that are, I remember Richard Feynman, the physicist, telling an interesting
Uh-huh.
story going to the university library, and I can't remember what it was that he was thinking about and researching at the time, but going to the librarian to saying like, I need a map of a cat. Like, where can I find a map of a cat? And they just looked at him like, you are the stupidest person in the world. What are you talking about? Those words don't make sense. Even though it was clear that what he meant was like, I need an anatomical chart that helps me understand
Yeah.
the terminology and taxonomy around cat anatomy. But but it got him talking a lot about exactly that piece around, we need to be able to have that kind of discussion where you can say, I need a map of a cat, and have something able to figure out like, here's what that is, and that's where sort of this interdomain breakdown in knowledge comes. The other piece that comes to mind is the number of times in either a library or a museum collection, there will be some critical piece of something that's found that is wildly interesting and shifts our ways of thinking about things, and it's just sitting in a weird shelf somewhere or other because it was either miscatalogued or cataloged with insufficient information for people to recognize that it's something that might have utility at some point. And things
Uh-huh.
like species that have been discovered in museum catalogs, because they were just miscatalogued, or was it Newton's? I'm trying to think if it was Newton or Galileo. I think it was Newton. All of his alchemical treatises, which were just sort of shelved away somewhere, and it took about 100 years for someone to pull them out and remember that they existed. And so that piece I'm
Hmm.
also really interested in, is all of the sort of excavation of already existing information that is just locked away in weird little containers somewhere or other.
This this is making me because of some weeks back, when I was specifically looking into, what is happening with sort of like live instant polling, or, technologies to facilitate massive group discussions of complex subjects. And, thanks to the language model finding different things happening, um, using picking like some of them, like picking like the five that look most relevant, and then doing like 5 iterations of fine tuning, like Llama 3 or something, where the resulting behavior and effectiveness of the model once we've fine tuned it would help us determine how good we think the process of group facilitation was, and figuring out how to make that entire process the fine, like
Yeah,
play out as the fine tuning of the model. That would be neat.
yeah,
To be like, we've picked 5 approaches to, massive collaboration, and we have to figure out how to, but how do we fuse it into the fine-tuning process? And the moment we start talking about that is somehow related to the fine-tuning process. Um, and then at the end of the day, we've got, 5 fine-tuned models based on the ones we're testing. And we go, oh, well, holacracy, wow, that model ended up, really behaving well once it was fine-tuned. Um, I think that's the kind of thing I would like to be somehow involved with.
yeah. No, I love that. I really love that. And I like the idea of that so much. We think a lot about like expansive knowledge, and really that piece of deepening knowledge of take a given event, say even, and it's like, here's the facilitative process map of how it was created, and then the execution on it, and then be able to do reasonably deep dive sort of survey, AI supported survey or debrief with the participants and the facilitators to say, like, how did that go? Did it meet these different things? What was your experience? What was well, what went well, what didn't? Because so often I think that there's a downward spiral that can happen even just around that kind of polling information, um, where people are like, well, it's kind of the town hall syndrome that can happen as well, where people are like, well, I'm not going to bother going to this town hall that's happening, even though it's on an issue that I kind of maybe either know a little bit about or care a little bit about, because I think it's going to be perfunctory anyways, and so I'm not going to bother showing up. Um, and similarly, when people are filling out feedback after the end of a process or something or other,
Mm.
it's often that feeling of like, well, there's 500 of us who are filling this thing out, and it's probably going to get very quickly gone over. So, I mean, I tend to nerd out and actually spend a bit of time trying to write the answers out. But often you'll get those very cursory, like, great job, exclamation mark responses. But then if people felt like, oh, there's actually a process that's here where there's really going to be a meaningful ability to understand, synthesize, and utilize my feedback to inform future process, then it gives further investment in what it happens. And so you get this upward spiral of both having tools that can help you do that and help you analyze how process went. And then that can encourage getting better intelligence in from people around a given process. And of course, once you have that,
Uh-huh.
then you have better building blocks for doing those larger kind of surveys of it to say, like, let's look at these 20 processes that used open space technology and see what the general feedback from people were. Or, here's these 6 organizations that are using holacracy to do their organization governance. And we now have in-depth information about how the people in each one feel about that and feel about how it's going. Yeah, so it's exciting to me that where LLMs start by saying, like, let's just grab all the information that's out there and somehow try to make sense out of that, that it's now leading to this process of refining how we think about thinking and about, like, how do we actually get copious, aligned, high quality information together, which it feels like kind of as a species we need to be doing anyways.
Yeah, it's a tangent, but this is where the kind of thing I'm doing all the time with the language models is trying to expand my vocabulary of mind, where I'd be like, okay, Claude, help me flush out my vocabulary to describe what's happening when I see conversations move towards reductive thinking, like false dichotomies and sort of box ticking, where what I really want to do is, um, move towards seeing the nuance and complexities of things. And but I don't have even the right words to describe that yet. And it'll be like, oh, you're talking about, like epistemological, blah, blah, blah. And then we start talking about what's been thought and said, sometimes from fields I didn't realize existed, about people who have for hundreds of years been discussing how thought can go towards reduction and towards, like, elaboration. And then I come out of that with, like, okay, here's 10 new terms for my flashcards that helps me, think about these things. And then it leads to, okay, so how would I talk about this to somebody who knows, you know, has some philosophical underpinning of these things, and how would I talk about it to somebody who doesn't, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But one of the things I find really interesting with your process is because you have the things you're thinking about, and then you use the tools to go far afield and to understand, like, what are the unknown unknowns that directly relate to the thing that I'm thinking about,
Mm.
the domains or bodies of knowledge, and then crystallizing that into terminology. I mean, not exclusively, but that's one key part, is like building up your own cross-domain vocabulary and having familiarity with, this is how this group of people would talk about
Yeah.
that issue. And that what I'm really curious to explore more, and I think, like, we should see if we can find, like, we need to get you a scholarship thing where you can focus on this, would be that piece of, as you do that, how does that affect the ways that we evoke knowledge or invoke knowledge from large language models by using the terminology of specific domains, so that
Uh-huh.
as you're using the right words, how does that, even though it is good at finding those cross-domain connections,
Yeah.
how does having the right vocabulary to be able to shorthand draw those different domains in impact the results that you get?
Yeah, and that's kind of that really has been for a while now part of the alchemy of like the big prompts that I use in getting mostly Claude the last few months, but getting it to be my ally in this is using some really specific terms that I'm thinking and I don't have enough evidence, but it seems to work where I feel like I'm activating possible channels by if I use these different terms, some of them are kind of philosophical or kind of niche terms, but I'm kind of turning on certain pathways to give me certain kinds of responses. And that's being like the whole problem that's being a bit of a concoction of um, which pathways through the crystalline structure I want more activated than others. Um, but yeah, it's funny because this stuff is um, um, there's a lot of even from the experts, there's just kind of guesswork into what's really going on in there. So
Yeah. When you think about like, in an aspirational world for you, where we really start figuring out how do we use these tools to come to effective, nuanced, equitable, wise decisions as a species. Like what are the pieces that for you feel like they have the most energy or the most juice? What should we
mm.
be exploring around that?
Well, the way I'm thinking about it is I like using the analogy of say people learning say physical arts versus say intellectual work, where it becomes pretty clear if somebody's learning guitar or it's a social dance. I've been doing all this like social dancing. Um, that intellectually understanding concept doesn't do you a lot of good on the dance floor or when you pick up the guitar. You need to practice that stuff. Um, it's like 5% theory, 95% practice, and that's clear quickly with a lot of skill-based arts. Whereas, okay, great, your teacher explains how like chord triages work or whatever, and it's like it doesn't help you until you do it a lot. But I don't think it's as clear to people with intellectual work. So this vocabulary, say me, I'm trying to develop this sort of vocabulary of democracy, right? Or this vocabulary of collaborative decision making, as vocabulary of intellectual inquiry. Um, it doesn't do me any good if I've learned the theory and it's just on the back burner. What I need to do is practice thinking that way, practice communicating that way, practice collaborating that way. Um, Same like I go to like a workshop and I do Brazilian zouk dancing, right? Um, I learn things that weekend and they don't do me any good unless I spend the next month practicing with my practice partners.
Yeah.
Then I can go to the dance floor and anybody I interact with, that's now become but second nature to me. So I think that needs to start, if we want democracy to work, we need more people not just understanding democratic processes, but practicing them in the way they engage with other people. So we're building them on an instinctive level. And when we begin to talk to them, we don't just, okay, we learned a lot of theory and now we default to fighting, right?
Yeah.
We practice that theory until we just default to like asking good questions, or we just default to those to these models that actually work in practice. Um, and what I see is that's what's often missing is people they don't realize you need to doesn't matter if you do a workshop in like nonviolent communication, if you don't practice it, the next argument you'll get into, you'll just go back to like yelling.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that would be and that's what I see the potential in AI and designing it to be our ally is we're designing it to practice with each other with its help to keep us on track until we're kind of like free to grow a bit in our instincts around our collective behavior. And I really think it could be helpful that way. If we're human focused,
Right.
if we keep making our interaction the important thing, not the AI. Yeah.
I really love that. There's so many different things that kind of sparks for me. I remember way back, in the like 2000 time when we were living in the little house on Elgin Street. One of the things talking about, and then it was pre a lot of AI thinking, but just thinking about knowledge abstraction and the internet, and talking about the degree to which, as we as a species increasingly need to be absorbing and digesting huge amounts of data and information in highly abstract ways in order to make decisions about what we're doing on the planet in sort of sensible ways. And that the challenge is that with each layer of abstraction, you have some slide away from the grounded reality, the experiential reality of how things are. And so that by the time you get up to the point of trying to make global policy about anything, you're teetering on this set of abstractions that can be just wildly divorced from the way things are. And I mean, I know it's not a new thing. That's been a problem in leadership for ages, where you have the echo chamber that surrounds a leader that just reinforces what their own beliefs around how a certain thing are anyways. But in the LLM world, it really is interesting the degree to which, and I mean, I really like that piece you're mentioning where we tend to get it because it's so easily demonstrable in something like dance or guitar. There's like you're talking about this very eloquently, but like play me a song, and that we don't do that nearly often enough because when you're tokenizing about tokens and talking about words, it's really easy to miss that part of where practice is important, and because it's very easy to talk about a theoretical piece or to talk about a practice that is intellectual without getting the person to like, well, great, show me, here's a conflict, resolve it. And it's really interesting to me looking at how like I think about pilots where it's for all kinds of different practical trades, but where you have your tests and then you log X number of hours before you can do the next thing. You know, if you're going to fly a commercial liner, here's the number of hundreds of hours that you have to have actually spent flying a plane, no matter what it is that you know. And to think about how that can inform the prompting process as well, or the fine-tuning process of if you have people who it's not simply, I'm a certified expert in X, Y, and Z, but you sort of have your flight hours logged as well, so that you can look at here's the different fine-tuning examples that are coming in, but here's where they're coming from. What it makes me think about is when the Group Works deck was being made, and it was facilitators from all over North America. Most of them, I mean, I was junior in the room, so a lot of these people had 30, 40 years of experience facilitating in a wide range of places, working together to try to discern what are the underlying patterns for effective facilitation. And figuring out how we get those sets of right people in the right rooms to be able to do that fine-tuning process around how both how LLMs work, but how we then link to ourselves. Because I think that part you were talking about, Jerry, I'll just wait a second to we can. Hey Jerry, how are you doing?
Good. My apologies for being late. I just finished the other call that overlapped, et cetera, et cetera. I'll try not to mess that up again.
No, it's all good. Again, that was my
Nick.
bad for sending something late. I can't remember if y'all have had a chance to meet. We can do like a little quick introduction, and then right now it's just been the two of us, and we've been having a really rich conversation. So I'll ping to where we're at. But have you two already been? I'm trying to remember if you've met or not.
I believe we have. You seem very familiar.
But that's what I'm wondering is I know I've watched recap recordings of conversations that you guys have had, and then I lose track of which ones I actually participated in.
And then you're not in my brain. I just checked, so that's a hint to me that maybe we haven't met. But maybe you have like a really familiar face or something. I know it's not the fish.
I'll say quickly that and when Jerry says checking his brain, Jerry has the most beautiful and comprehensive second brain that is out there. Like, I mean, it's acknowledged in the world to be like the biggest second brain that is out there. And
I checked.
Yeah.
I checked that out after one of the conversations you posted, and I watched the whole hour. I went through, Jerry, to your website and learned to follow it up a little bit in what you are all about.
Awesome, thank you.
And I'll say Nick is one of the most fluent people I've ever met. I mean, there's many glorious things. Nick and I have known each other for a long time, but one of the things that has been a really neat gift that Nick has been bringing to a lot of the discourse we've been having is a good understanding and lots of practical experience playing with prompting in order to help get. Well, I'll let you describe it. Actually, sorry, I'll try to not put words in your mouth.
my intellectual history, like I went off and was like a weird artist for 20 years, came back to, university more recently, and was, realized that there were sort of some missing pieces in the resources available as like a student. And coming back at it with a real adult mind rather than like a youth mind, in sort of being given these really complex like social philosophy texts and being like, what the heck do these words mean?
Mm-hmm.
And started using the large language models and being like, well, what does Foucault mean by discourse versus when Boudot uses that word? And realized that the language models are extremely good most of the time, better than any of the resources I could find, in helping me understand what this author versus, or this context versus this context uses these words to mean. And then I kept developing this larger and larger prompt where I would just feed it at the beginning to like, hey, Nori, this giant prompt, like it's a couple thousand words now, where I'm telling a language model how to be my ally in improving my cognitive linguistic abilities for like a whole set of goals. And it includes a bunch of shorthands where I could just start with the word like, teleology, and it would give me like a breakdown according like I give it like this laundry list of how to break that. If I just put in a word, it'll just give me this laundry list. And then I could say orient. And it knows when I say orient, it's another laundry list of what I want it to do. I want it to tell me which fields and faculties talk about this in which contexts, and what fields of knowledge does it fit into, fields of knowledge fit into it. So I can, like, oh, teleology, we're within like, epistemology, and it fits to this, and it's all like these areas of philosophy, and this is a big thing, and these areas, da da da. So it's like 20 shorthands, and then I can just like start a conversation, and just a lot of time I'm just putting in one word at a time, and then I can even say to it, okay, quiz me on the fundamental on this topic, on like teleology, deontology, and related philosophical terms, and it knows it needs to make up like a dozen terms related to the topic, and then follow this laundry list to quiz me on it until
Well, I think I would flunk that exam.
Uh-huh. But
Pretty sure.
yeah, this has been my big project the last year, and it's been pretty fascinating.
It sounds great.
And Nori, in a sec, let's get you to introduce yourself. But I'll say Nori is one of the people who I was singing your praises yesterday, Nori, to someone when we were talking about both creative ways of doing licensing, but also just that piece around collective decision making, and bringing people together. And sort of Nori and Jerry, I don't know if you two have had a chance to talk yet, but both of you work in environments that involve generating trust online and building genuine community instead of trying to short circuit the actual trust process. But Nori.
Yeah, my name is Nori Nishigaya. I work largely in the space of decentralized collaboration and governance, and arising out of the blockchain space. But really, the stuff that I'm working on isn't about the blockchain and the technology. It's around the community that formed around that because of the promise of the decentralization and being able to do all that. So we're leaning into a lot of experimental models, primarily through a group called Odin, which is the Open Decentralized Innovation Network. And we're really exploring models like Sociocracy 3.0, heavily influenced by books like Brave New Work, Reinventing Organizations. We're now exploring another one called Work with Source from Tom Nixon, really talking about the kind of the idea that all ideas come channeled through somebody and they're considered source, and what's their role to birth this thing. And it's an important concept to, I think, keep people's engagement, their passion, and really channel all this energy into the right stuff. So trying to meld that into some of the sociocratic principles we're doing. So yeah, we're a huge community around this that is really experimenting and playing with it and thinking about these things.
What was the source book again? I distracted myself for a second there.
It's this
Work with Source. Thank you.
By Tom Nixon.
Thanks.
And it's a really great kind of summary of the work of Peter Koenig, who really came up with the concept of source. and working on that. But also a lot of stuff we're doing is integrally informed. So it's nice. There's an upcoming workshop from the Sociocracy crew themselves, 3.0, that is looking at spiral dynamics and how that informs sociocracy and kind of getting into those kind of things. So a lot of interesting stuff going on right now in this space, and that's kind of where my passion is.
Yay.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to have the three of you in a virtual room together. Maybe Nick and I were sort of riffing back and forth a little bit over the last half hour. I'll maybe, and then Nick help throw some of the marbles we've been playing with kind of into the space, and then we can just kind of jam wherever we are. So again, we've been talking a bunch. Oh yeah, Jerry, go ahead.
Should I introduce myself to Nori?
Yeah, please. Sorry.
Just so you know, like, who I am. I was a tech industry trends analyst for a dozen years back in the .com era. Left that in '98 to go run off and do my own stuff. And I'm much less of a tech head now, because I started wondering, like, why are systems so broken? Why are we designing systems that mess everybody up instead of systems that are helpful? So I ended up with a thesis about trust and a thing I call design from trust, which is a way of redesigning systems with the assumption of good intent as a starting point, not naive good intent, but there's bad actors out there. Just stop designing the whole system around the bad actors. Start designing the system so that the good actors can go nuts and crazy and fix shit, and then try to co-opt the bad actors to become good actors. And the really, really bad actors, okay, we need to figure out how to neutralize them. But this applies in system after system, around the world. And so I'm still trying to get that idea in the world. I also curate the world's largest mind map in the Brain software. I was on their first press tour. I was the first analyst on their launch press tour. And years later, just recently, Harlan, the inventor, told me, Jerry, I wish we'd known that the rest of the press tour wasn't going to go like the first stop. Because Harlan opened his laptop, my wet brain saw him demo the Brain software, and I was like, oh, that's how I think. And weirdly, I was in the middle of writing an issue of our newsletter about link management and mind mapping. And I had none of the software I found did I like, and this one became the hero of the issue, et cetera. So I published my Brain online, and I just added you to it. And now we can go back to things. Sorry.
Thank you, Jerry, very much. Yeah. So I'll throw a couple of the marbles we've been tossing around. So the overall domain we've been kind of playing with and exploring are, what are some of the ways that the current AI and upcoming AI processes, technologies, approaches people are taking with them inform democracy, collective intelligence, collective decision making, and generally kind of knowledge and growth. Some of the pieces that we've talked about. Nick talked briefly about, well, actually talked in depth, you can see on the earlier part of the recording, but around the ways that LLMs are really great at, if you describe a given thing, being able to find the other siloed areas of knowledge that use different language in order to generate knowledge about the same topic. And that's something where it's really helping break down a lot of the knowledge silos that are there. We talked a little bit about so many different bits. Well, one other key part that we were talking about, Nick was bringing up the piece around experience and around how when you're doing something like playing guitar or dancing, it's very easy to know the difference between what I know in theory and here's what I can actually do in practice. But then with intellectual knowledge, we often get blurry around that, and that someone can talk a lot about something like nonviolent communication without necessarily knowing how to embody it and how to actually practice it. Another one of the pieces we were talking about is that piece around how to use LLMs around these different pieces to consistently be bringing people together so that people are meeting, people are practicing, people are learning, and the importance of using them to generate questions that help us explore the space rather than looking to them for answers, especially in a sort of reflexive, perfunctory, I need to check off boxes on a document, rather than I'm curious and interested in the domain that we're discussing. Nick, maybe I'll toss things over to you for a quick course correct on what I've said, and then we can dive in further.
That you capture a lot of it. I mean, there was one point where one of the things that's been be in my mind is the idea of at some point where I would love to see a bunch of people fine-tuning, like one of the open weight models, like Llama 4 comes out, and we pick a few of the architectures of collaboration, and we use it as a way to practice our ability to collaborate in fine-tuning the model, as as a practice of testing that architecture, and then seeing which resulting model, we try sociocracy, we try holacracy, we try different processes, and then in the end we say, well, which model worked the best according to this criteria that we determined together. And something like that I think would be a really neat process, because we could test the collaboration tools while also getting deep into working through some nitty gritty about, I love the term agonistic dissensus, where we need a system that allows a certain degree of disagreement, and that there's a healthiness to that. But at what point do you draw the line and say, okay, look, what you're saying is just not acceptable, right? So we get all this like tough stuff like that. But I would love to be part of something like that. We're going to get a large amount of people. We're going to fine tune a model a few times, test different processes.
I love that idea. That's very topical for me. Like yesterday, we had the kickoff meeting to form a group around this idea that we're calling collaborative sparks. And one of the things we came up with is, how do we get different communities to experiment with things like holacracy, sociocracy, different patterns? How do we collect their collective kind of stories around that, and then have selection and evaluation criteria around surfacing different patterns and pieces of patterns, and maybe even having places where people can contribute meta maps to say, of these 73 patterns, if you're in this problem space, we found that 1, 7, and 17 strung together in this way works really well. And being able to surface those things, and that definitely gets us into the human collaborative trust space. And then there's so much information there too, that I think the AI thing can help us create those connections and maybe summarize things. And we've even talked about, like, it'd be great to have AI kind of suck in all of our meetings and all of our different conversations. And then somebody goes, we should have a proposal around that idea. And then maybe AI is that first step of proposal forming. And then humans can take a look at that and say, this is really good. It incorporated everyone's viewpoints and concerns and objections and all that kind of stuff, and resolved into this thing that humans can now look at and discuss and move forward with.
I just posted a link to my brain. I hosted recently, just on my own initiative. I run weekly calls around Open Global Mind, which is a community of practice I started at the start of lockdown. And then I was like, I want to pop out of our normal routine and have 4 calls about governance and what's working in governance. I don't know that I was satisfied with the calls, but we turned over a lot of stuff. And if you click down through the calls, because each of the calls is uploaded to YouTube, but my notes for each call are surrounding each call. Happy to screen share and show you, but we found a lot of interesting stuff. It's just that I was aiming for, hey, if somebody made you king tomorrow, what kinds of governance mechanisms would you institute, right? And nobody's got great answers. And there's hierarchy, holacracy, duocracy. There's lots of. I have a thought in my brain for ocracies. I'll post it in the chat in a second. There's a lot of alternative forms of governance, and there's very little consensus about what to do. It's astonishing.
I wonder if some of that's from a lot of reading and less actual practice. Like when you get into it, it's like, oh, this doesn't work at all, or we're not implementing it right, or like Sociocracy 3.0 has all these discrete patterns, and we're like, this one's great and this one's great, and we're finding out that the theory behind it is really deep, and the more you connect and the more patterns you use, the more powerful each pattern becomes. And they start out saying you don't have to adopt the whole thing. You can just take the patterns as needs arise through tension. But then we're finding that if you adopt all these patterns, the sum is way greater than just each little piece brought in. So it's an interesting kind of discovery through live practice that you just can't get by reading about it and thinking this is a great idea or not.
One thing that would be neat, and this sort of we were talking Nick and I earlier about that, with that difference between the theoretical knowledge and the practical knowledge, it's like the equivalent of flight hours for a pilot. That you have to have those before you do certain things. It would be great to, in a conversation like this, and especially though when you have a larger number of people, so you don't have necessarily that presumption of deep knowledge about each other, or of, well, yeah, of knowing what each person's kind of trajectory is, but to simply have it so that when Patrick talks about generative AI, that it can pull up a little bit of information and say, like, by the way, this is the book, these are the 2 books that he's written about that topic, and here's the like 4 years worth of courses that he's been teaching around it, or whatever those pieces might be, not to overly privilege academic certifications, but simply to make it so that when someone is saying, well, here's what I think about how we should be doing road planning for our city, that it can say, by the way, this is something that this person like has a whole bunch of practical knowledge around, and that's a useful thing.
I love the exploring what works in governance kind of idea. It reminds me of here locally, there's a thing called Salmon Nation, and they have an annual, what they call the Festival of What Works. And they gather all sorts of people together from the bioregion. And we talk about regenerative agriculture and governance models and all sorts of stuff. And it's really hands-on people on the ground talking about what they're doing and what the success stories have been. And that might be a really interesting thing either for Thamazo or Partech or whatever, to have a kind of in this area a festival of what works and have people present kind of their stories.
We're going to be getting, I think, a little bit involved with the Kootenay Lake Innovation Center's Resilience Festival, which I think there may be some interesting opportunities. I know some of their stuff's on the technological side, but there may be some opportunities to kind of play on some of that. I'll mention briefly, because each of you is one of the people who I would love to engage on this, but I have just gotten, it looks like I'm going to get about 6 months worth of time to have most of my full-time work be talking with folks like y'all about the meta crisis, while also trying to put together the tools that allow us to document and summarize and knowledge graph and play and invite others into the conversation. So yeah, I'm glad that Marie instigated this conversation around like how AI informs democratic process, just because it's so core right now. One of the other pieces that strikes me too, Jerry, as someone who has such an extensive introspective and experientially graphed set of information that's there for you, and as retrieval augmented generation is increasingly becoming something where it's very knowledge graph amenable, and people are looking at how do you tie into things like that to be powering AI. It would be really interesting to be exploring, and I'm sure you already are, but I'd love to hear what kind of explorations you're doing around how you can have a tool like that spider through that corpus of your own experience and knowledge.
So it's funny, I have a standing call with my geekiest friend, Pete Kaminsky, who is the Scotty, Spock, and Data of Open Global Mind, all rolled into one person, of course. He tried to connect the brain has a new API and to GPT's API. And we got like 60% through, and we're stuck because the brain isn't responding in the way we're expecting it to. And the brain hasn't been responsive about fixing that, which reminds me, I need to go ping them and say, hey, people, could you please fix this? One of the problems with GPT connection into my brain is that I don't use the brain for long stretches of prose. Like I don't write editorials in the brain. I write them in Google Docs or post them on Medium or post them to markdown files on GitHub, which is how Pete's kind of wiki works, because we use GitHub for version control. And then Obsidian as an editor is a very wiki-like editor. The only problem is the URLs are all munged up and you've got to go figure out where the actual website URL is. And that's a little broken. Anyway, sorry for the detour. But I'm really interested in how these things all fit together. So yes. And we're trying, but we haven't made it succeed yet. Oh, the thing I was trying to say is, in order for GPT to understand my brain enough, it's going to have to infer a lot from how I connect things. I do a lot of thing above group is the collective thing they have in common. And if I tell you that, you'll be like, oh, okay, so all these things are dogs and all these things are actors, or all these things are causes of the global financial crisis. And if you can manage that, you're 80% ready to start interpreting how I editorialized and curated while adding to my brain.
That's a marvelous benchmark because there's all of the different benchmarks for how LLMs perform, but it's basically like a Confucian benchmark where Confucius had his whole thing of like the difference between the person who you show 3 corners of the thing to and they can figure out the other corner versus the person you can show 1 corner to and they figure out the other 3 corners.
I don't know about that. I only know about his 5 cardinal relationships.
Oh, okay. I think this was confusing.
Oh, it sounds great. I'd love to know
It
more
would be
about it.
great to make a training set for using for benchmarks for different LLMs for having increasingly abstract sets of collections and what it is that binds them together, to see which LLMs are good at grokking and which ones aren't. Another piece I'll quickly throw that was part of the conversation with Nick, but that relates, I've been immersed in a lot of thought about decolonizing knowledge systems and self-decolonization lately. And one of the pieces that came out in this conversation was that as you work on any given tools, and our conversations with our friend Lee White have really been helping inform a lot of that. But the ways in which if you're building any tool that's designed to help emergent collective engagement with people, taking a step back and making how does that tool work in an introspective way to actually help the individual as well, so that they can be both understanding themselves, advocating for themselves, doing the things that they need to for themselves, and coming from that place of that any emergent non-transactional, non-exploitative system needs to be grounded in the agency and support of the individuals who are participating in it. And Marie's comment that kind of got this conversation started really struck a chord for me around that, where I was saying, like, if you have these systems that are great for bringing together global democracy in useful ways, it should also be able to help you figure out your grocery list or your calendar for your family. And that just really rung true for me.
Wouldn't that be nice? I'm going to have to bounce in a couple of minutes. I apologize for arriving late and having to bounce. I love this conversation. Can we book a repeat?
Absolutely. No, I will. I'll get in touch with each of y'all, and we'll find a time that works for you all plus Marie, and then we'll make that maybe hopefully an ongoing discussion. It will continue to record, to put out there, and to find more people to play with.
What questions are in your heads that we should all be pondering in between? Do we have enough time to do a quick go around?
Yeah, let's do a quick kind of popcorn around that.
For me, it's easy because all of you have said things that I now I'm going to sit down and read up on and add to my flashcards.
One of the key questions for me has to do with real-time sense making and how these different tools can be creating functional feedback loops during human discourse in a way that is supportive and not disruptive of the flow of conversation.
The call that got double booked over us that I couldn't actually move in time was with a fellow in Zimbabwe who I met through the EXO network a couple of years ago. He's lovely. He's an entrepreneur. He's doing a bunch of stuff. And he's trying to open source everything he does, but he's also trying to make a living. But he says cash should be an outcome of other intentions and other things you do. Awesome. But we talked a bunch about the blending of indigenous wisdom with modern approaches. And there's a thought in my brain, which is how do we blend the best of the old and the new, which is very high for me. It's like, we used to know a lot of shit, and then colonialism basically destroyed it. And any attempts to decolonize whatever are being met with the same energy that's meeting woke, which is like sucky. I think that's like, woke got turned against itself real fast. My sport is Aikido, and last night we actually did some videotape on my mat of Aikido moves because I for several reasons, one of which is I want to illustrate how forces can be reversed and how, there's a really nice metaphors in Aikido for how the world unfortunately works. So all that stuff is high for me.
For me, I love the thinking of how to combine AI support and things with the human. Like that's kind of one of the things that's top of mind right now is I'm like trying to form this new slow analog movement as a kind of retreat from all this high tech everything, but recognizing that there are some parts of our lives that we need to move fast, and AI can help us move faster and organize information and summarize things and do all sorts of stuff that's great. But how do we also maintain the human connection and the high trust and the meaning and value of the spaces we create? And what's that balance? Like, I'm now like retreating from digital into paper analog kind of note taking, except for the stuff I need to share. And like, yeah, trying to find that balance. But my focus right now is like blockchain always wants to say we can code law and put it on blockchain and have these decentralized autonomous organizations. And we're coming at it from the other way, saying we need to figure out the human levels and how we make decisions and collaborate first before we encode this thing into law on chain. So
Yeah.
we're starting from the squishy human side and figuring that out first.
If I may be blunt, blockchain always struck me as being naive about how humans work, and then also way too libertarian on its assumptions about, hey, this is going to work if we just do this, this, and this. I'm like, I don't think that's going to pencil out. But there's a bunch of really interesting technology that got created and a bunch of interesting intentions. Like DAOs are interesting. They're just not designed the way humans actually like collectively govern and work.
One of the things, Rory, that is in your sort of like realm of expertise that I'd love to talk around some of that with on a future call. Like the whole blockchain thing, if you think of it rather than here's the technologies that enable this, as here's a flare that went up, and all of the people who care about that sort of stuff started coming together and talking about it.
Right.
And I know that that's what you've been really looking at, is like, who are these people who have come together around this and what are they up to in part? And that would be neat. Also, just quickly bookmark that, Jerry, I'd love to, no, I know you have to go, but I'll email, but you and your friend from Zimbabwe, and then some of our colleagues in Kenya, and then some of the indigenous folks here in BC, I would love to get a call together to have some of those folks talking about exactly that topic.
Sounds great. Well, let's plan that too.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Must bolt with apologies, but terrific to meet you guys. Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks, Jerry.
Bye, Jerry.
Wonderful. Yeah. I don't know what your both time is like, but if there's any sort of closing thoughts or pieces that you want to bookmark for us to talk about, or reflections that are there, I'd love to.
I'll just reiterate. Yeah, my list down here, like dissemination, knowledge graph amenable, festival of what works. Like, there's just a bunch of things that went onto my reading list. So I will be looking into some of that while before our next meeting, understanding where each of you is coming from more.
For me, kind of just exploring the relationships between us and what we're all up to and the ideas and thoughts is a really great space. And then from that, we'll probably move naturally into like concrete, we should do this, and kind of focus a lot of this into some concrete outcomes. Might be really nice to move towards, but
Yeah.
I'm in no hurry for that.
Yeah, Nori,
yeah.
I know better what Daniels thinks about and works on. I met you at our AI conference last year. I was really glad you came on today, because you just said a bunch of things that I have a better sense of what you're up to than I ever did before.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's always great to hang out with you all in these kind of spaces. Yeah, and I appreciate Daniel bringing everybody together, really being embodying that mycelial kind of thing to make sure we're all connected in the right way.
Yeah, and I'm excited about looking at it as we can have hopefully this ongoing set of conversations, making that public, but then having that be a jumping off point, so that ideally anybody could look at a call like this and then be able to say, like, who's this Nori character? What's he up to? And be able to have it dive into more engagement and knowledge around the areas of activity that you have. Because so much of it does feel like new. I mean, I know we talked about this before, but from Limicon and other things like that, there's so many groups of people working in these similar spaces who are all aware of how much we need to be starting to cross-pollinate between the groups. And so I think it's a fun opportunity where everything's just really ripe for that kind of dialogue and deepening between the different groups that are out there to happen. So thank you all for helping model that and helping figure out how we do that.
Yeah, looking forward to that. And to all future people watching this video, yeah, I'm looking forward to our
Mhm.
conversation.
Definitely. Enjoy
Well-
your weekends.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
You too.